Welcome, everyone. Welcome in from the cold. It's time to get started, and just some announcements. I'm Bill Saunders. I'm a Senior Vice President and Senior Counsel at Americans United for Life, and we thank you all for coming. There'll be other people coming in as the day goes on. If you feel like, we know that people might have to come and go. We hope you can stay for this whole thing, but if you need to leave, we understand. There will not be a break. We had originally planned for a break, but we won't have one, so if you need to visit the facilities, feel free to do it. My role today is mainly going to be to kind of keep things flowing along and make some introductions. I do want to recognize, before we get started, one of our board members who's here, Donna Harrison, and is going to be a speaker. Thank you for coming. And you will enjoy hearing what Donna has to say. You'll learn a lot. Also, I want to mention for everybody, in case you didn't get this, you're not aware of this, we're having a reception tomorrow afternoon from 4 to 6 at the AUL office, which is just around the corner, 14th and G. It's 655 15th Street, but it's just around the corner. You're welcome to attend a reception we're having honoring Advocates for Life, which is our law student chapters. So, with no further ado, I'll move on now. Again, this conference is the Future of Roe, Women, Health, and Law in the Obama Era, and we'll have a number of speakers you will be interested to hear from various perspectives, medical, legal, political. Our first speaker, and to set the stage for us, is our President and CEO at Americans United for Life, Charmaine Yoest. You probably all know her. She's a leading thinker and innovator in the pro-life movement. She received her PhD in politics from the University of Virginia, and she's a frequent spokesperson on pro-life issues. You probably saw her on PBS this week. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Charmaine.
Thank you, Bill. The challenge with being the moderator for a day like this is that you yourself don't get introduced, and I would just like to thank Bill for doing this for us today. We are so fortunate as a pro-life movement to have someone with Bill's distinguished credentials, having graduated from Harvard Law School and then dedicating his entire career to defending the most defenseless. We are very, very grateful for your service to the movement, Bill. And I am so grateful for each and every one of you. We woke up this morning, and I don't know why I thought that pro-lifers wouldn't be hardy enough to brave through the snow, but I am so glad to see each and every one of you, and I'm excited about this day. It is a sobering day to be commemorating the 40th anniversary of Roe, but I am still excited about this day because we are all still here. We are still here, we're still committed, and why we are here today is to emphasize the fact that we have a very definite strategy that is gaining ground and gaining momentum. And that's what I want to kick us off with in talking about this morning. It really is a tremendous irony that this week brings together in very close proximity the second inauguration of the most aggressively pro-abortion president that we've ever seen in American history, just one day before the 40th anniversary of Roe, and just prior to our annual March for Life tomorrow. These events tangled together in time reflect the strange state of play in abortion politics today. While the abortion rights side has been tallying up on the ledger the marquee victories, the presidency and the Senate in November, the pro-life movement, we have been developing enough momentum under the radar to make our antagonists definitely queasy. The abortion lobby today is a little like the old Soviet bloc that looked invincible, right up to the very day that it collapsed under the weight of its own stagnation. The old guard of the Kremlin were on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of science and the truth in very much the same way that big abortion is today. Cecile Richards, the very uber-glossy Manhattan-based president of the world's largest abortion provider, Planned Parenthood, is admittedly considerably more stylish than Mikhail Gorbachev. We have to give her her due. But they do have in common a dependence on the power and money of the state to prop up their failed ideologies. While pro-lifers, we're still stinging from the loss of the presidency and, let's be honest, perhaps the Supreme Court as well. Savvy observers who are looking at the bigger picture resemble weathermen standing on a calm beach warning of a hurricane building offshore. We really won't see much of anything happen at the national level in the next several years, although we will try. There is a rising tide of pro-life legislation passing at the state level that is dramatically changing the contours of abortion policy in this country. For example, in the last 2 years alone, since the 2010 midterm elections, our legal team at Americans United for Life has helped enact nearly 50 pro-life laws across this country. In addition, and perhaps more importantly, we have a tremendous tidal wave of pro-life legislation in the pipeline. Notably, over the past 2 years, we've had 2,500 requests for our model legislation, and our legal team was at work in 39 states. While most attention is focused on the president's reelection and the maintenance of the status quo nationally, at the state level, we actually saw modest improvements in pro-life representation, and that's actually where it counts, closest to the people, closest to the grassroots, and that's where the momentum is most definitely building. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking offshore, and I'm here to tell you today there is a storm surge coming. Even pro-abortion activists see the wind picking up. In many ways, we see signs that the abortion activists understand even better than we do how much they're losing ground. Witness, for example, the recent resignation of Nancy Keenan, the now former president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, the organization formerly known as the National Abortion Rights Action League. She stepped down acknowledging that the pro-life movement has real dynamism and strength among young people. Newsweek did an interview with her, and in it, Nancy referenced the March for Life, and here's what Newsweek said. This past January, when Keenan's train pulled into Washington's Union Station, a few blocks from the Capitol, she was greeted by a swarm of anti-abortion rights activists. It was the 37th annual March for Life, organized every year on January 22nd, the anniversary of Roe. Quote, "I just thought, my gosh, they are so young," Keenan recalled. "There are so many of them, and they are so young." She stepped down this past May and said explicitly that she was doing so because she thought the pro-choice movement was getting too gray. So she's been succeeded by Ilyse Hogue, a woman in her early 40s, who has a Twitter avatar of herself as Batgirl. It's an interesting attempt to burnish her hipster cred, but it's also a small and telling symbol of the essential credo at the heart of the modern abortion rights sorority: girl power. My 15-year-old told me I needed to do that with attitude, and I think I might need a little bit more coaching on that. So here's the central premise of today's feminism. It's that abortion as reproductive freedom is the irreducible minimum of feminine empowerment. A leader of the third wave of feminism, who I had an opportunity to debate about 20 years ago, Rebecca Walker, who's the daughter of Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple, wrote an essay some years ago in Harper's Magazine addressing her comments to younger women and outlining the feminist conception of reproductive rights as power. Here's what she said, and I'm going to quote it at length because it's worth hearing. "I hope that the speech I'm going to give you will encourage you to see that your abortion can be a rebellious and empowering act. It is an act through which you can assert yourself, one which can enable you to feel more connected to women around the world. It is a surgical operation with a mission. My hope is that after your abortion, you will commit some part of your life to making sure that others are able to claim their own rights. By doing this, you will use your abortion to connect with women everywhere. You will connect your very special person with the very important political, and you will begin to know your own power. See, most Americans don't understand that the rationale for abortion rights has subtly but very significantly shifted over time. And that's why it's so important for us here at the 40th anniversary to spend some time thinking about what the other side is doing and what they are saying. For decades, the postmodern feminist movement has pursued brilliant, very disciplined messaging. They talked about equal rights for women, and they've consistently framed the abortion issue using appealing and unassailable comments like choice and privacy, which are very all-American kinds of concepts. However, in the early 90s, very subtly and very effectively, they began deploying the subtext of power, carefully marketing this as a new theme into the American collective subconscious, unrecognized by most of us just going along because it was woven into various and sundry speeches and messages that were not labeled pro-abortion. They started talking about feminine empowerment. President Obama himself provided the best example of this in the 2008 campaign when he said, "A woman's ability to decide how many children to have and when, without interference from the government, is one of the most fundamental rights we possess. It is not just an issue of choice, but equality and opportunity for all women." It's not just an issue of choice, but equality and opportunity for all women. The key point, though, is that this worldview is being deployed on multiple levels. There's far more to it than merely marketing. The messaging on women in power has moved in concert with the underlying legal strategy defending abortion rights, and that's what I really want to help us talk about today, is seeing how the messaging is going together with the legal strategy, because this is a legal forum today to talk about where we go next with our legal strategy. The legal rationale for reproductive freedom has evolved significantly over time, and it has tracked with this messaging. In the 1992 decision Casey v. Planned Parenthood, the court asserted that we must tolerate abortion because of a reliance interest. And here's what Justice Kennedy wrote for the majority in Casey. He said, "For 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail." And then here's the key sentence. "The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives." This notion that women must have access to abortion has come to permeate feminist thought. In fact, AUL's counterpart in the abortion lobby, the legal arm of the feminist movement, the Center for Reproductive Rights, states explicitly on their website in their self-definition, they say, "Reproductive rights, the foundation for women's self-determination over their bodies and sexual lives, are critical to women's equality and to ensuring global progress toward just and democratic societies." So take a moment there and let's process the fact that they're going from the individual woman and her democratic rights to a just and global society. That's a very significant layering of messages. So this connection illustrates just how foundational reproductive rights and democracy linked together has become. The connective tissue is woven into feminist jurisprudence. For example, Justice Ginsburg, dissenting from the Supreme Court's decision in Gonzalez v. Carhart, the partial birth abortion case, wrote that women cannot enjoy equal citizenship stature without abortion on demand. Ladies and gentlemen, this is so significant that at the Supreme Court level, we have a Supreme Court justice who is arguing that we as women cannot be equal citizens without abortion. Let us not fool ourselves about what we are up against. Well, let's just see who wins. Now they are putting Batgirl against the baby. That's what it comes down to. It's Batgirl against the baby. It's going to take, however, I would argue to you, and I want to transition now into a little bit more optimism, it's going to take more than a cartoon superhero to countervail the simple, authentic voice of the sonogram pictures that now spread so easily through social media. Let's think for a minute of how the pro-choice crowd has had to change their messaging. I got to thinking about this because a reporter asked me about this earlier this week. She asked how we had changed our messaging. And it occurred to me that they've had to change their messaging a whole lot more than we have. For example, I remember 20 years ago when I was pregnant with my first daughter, and I was invited to debate Kim Gandy, who was then the president of NOW. And she showed up. Coincidentally, we were both pregnant, which was an odd situation. She showed up with a blazer that had a small pin on it, which I couldn't originally see, but afterwards as we were talking, I leaned in to see what the pin was, and it was a coat hanger. But think for a minute, it has been a very, very long time since we've heard anyone in their movement talk about back-alley abortions. Maybe a little bit around the edges, but it's not mainstream messaging for them anymore, and maybe that's just because there are a dozen legal back-alley abortion clinics under investigation across the country today for unsafe and unsanitary conditions. I thought that wasn't the way it was supposed to be under a legal abortion regime. Maybe they don't want to talk about back-alley abortions because this summer Tanya Reeves died after being left to hemorrhage for 5 hours in a Planned Parenthood clinic. That wasn't the back alley. That clinic is situated right across the street from Grant Park and the Art Institute in Chicago. It's not the back alley. And they left her. On the other hand, our movement has been remarkably consistent. We have always and ever celebrated the intrinsic value of each individual life. It's very simple. It's the good, the true, and the beautiful. 2 decades ago, our message was, life, what a beautiful choice. Beginning in 1997, Choose Life license plates became available. Today, I just looked this up, they're available in 27 states. Anybody want to hazard a guess how many states you can get pro-choice license plates in? 4. So we have 27 and they have 4. AUL Action, our own AUL Action's 2010 and 2012 political theme was built around life counts. In the next few weeks, we'll be releasing the 8th edition of our pro-life playbook, Defending Life. Defending life. Our messaging is very simple. It's simple because it's true. Our opponents, however, have a tougher challenge. For starters, they can't actually talk about what they're defending. Take, for example, an article in RH Reality Check that came out just this week, and it was addressing it 40 years down the road. How do we change attitudes of the people who are still in the middle? And they said, how do we make it happen? Once again, the answer is to stop talking about abortion, or at least stop saying the word itself. Change the language, this theorist recommended. Talk about it as women's reproductive rights. Don't talk about it as abortion rights. So NARAL, I was very specific at the beginning of this talk by drawing out their name and how it has changed over time, because in 2003 they airbrushed abortion out of their name, and now they have this odd situation of going by an acronym. However, now, only a short decade later, in 2013, Planned Parenthood started the year by announcing that they are moving away from the choice rubric. They said they would be talking about personal decisions and how complicated abortion is, without, of course, actually saying the word abortion. It's complicated. To me, that sounds a little bit more like a Facebook status than a moral argument. But it certainly does reflect reality for them. This is a reality they've been grappling with for a while. Going back to 1995, the feminist theorist Naomi Wolf wrote in The New Republic, "We need to contextualize the fight to defend abortion rights within a moral framework that admits that the death of a fetus is a real death." So what will it be? And this is Naomi speaking, not me. So what will it be? Wanted fetuses are charming, complex, REM dreaming little beings whose profile on the sonogram looks just like daddy, but unwanted ones are mere uterine material. That is complicated indeed. So now they don't talk about coat hangers. They are shifting to angel's wings as an alternative symbol. One website has a headline, "Find your own spirit image to help heal the abortion experience." Put an angel or a fairy on your personal altar or sacred space and use it to remind you of the sad but sometimes necessary sacrifice of abortion. Jennifer Baumgardner, who's a somewhat well-known in abortion circles author of Abortion and Life, asks, but note she does not answer her own question, what do you do if a patient wants to baptize the remains? Yes, that is complicated. So this week, Salon had an article that is taking the internet by storm. Mary Beth Williams asks defiantly and breezily, so what if abortion ends life? So what? That's her thesis. Here's the and this is her. Here's the complicated, see, they are nothing if not consistent. Here's the complicated reality in which we live. All life is not equal. That's a difficult thing for liberals like me to talk about, lest we wind up looking like death panel loving, kill your grandma and your precious baby stormtroopers. It's complicated. So what's a girl to do? Or an abortion lobby, as the case may be, with all this complication? Williams, just like Jennifer Baumgardner, never does fully find a way to answer or even finesse the question. In the end, she just callously admits it all comes down to brute power. And here I'm quoting her again. A fetus can be a human life without having the same rights as the woman in whose body it resides. She's the boss. Her life and what is right for her circumstances and her health should automatically trump the rights of the non-autonomous entity inside of her always. She's the boss. That's girl power, all right. We're moving from choice to it's complicated because the rhetorical dodge is not working for them anymore. The abortion lobby doesn't want to talk about abortion as choice because that implies that there might be a decision to weigh, a moral concern to consider and even agonize over. They want to exclusively shift to the language of health care so that abortion becomes routine, commonplace, and morally neutral like going to the dentist. Believe me, they've noticed all the women on the mall carrying the signs, "I regret my abortion." Choice is not working for them anymore. But here I want to pivot, and please pivot with me. The messaging goes along with their underlying agenda. We cannot become distracted by their language. The real move they are making is not merely a rhetorical one. Abortion activists are actively and brazenly pivoting from choice to coercion. When viewed through the lens of public policy instead of private decisions, choice, you see, encompasses individual liberty and a freedom to dissent. Privacy has long since vanished in the context of abortion policy. The abortion statists believe the procedure should permeate the public sphere and the public square. They want abortion defined as fundamental health care for women, and they want every American to pay for it. They want every American to participate. They do not believe an individual should have a choice whether to participate in abortion. They plan to force every American, regardless of their personal beliefs and values, to participate in abortion as part of the everyday fabric of our culture through tax subsidies and occupational mandates. What they could not win through choice, they intend to impose through coercion. In response, what do we see at Americans United for Life? The number one piece of model legislation, that we are getting requests for is the one that assists in defunding the abortion industry. People are not happy about being coerced into paying for abortion. Following closely right after that is our model that reinforces rights of conscience. Even Time magazine. Let's pick up the theme of the fact that some of us today, as we're facing the 40th anniversary of the March for Life, some of us may be feeling discouraged. And what I would say to you is the other side understands better than we do how we are succeeding. Be encouraged. Even Time magazine. I know that you all have seen this, but let's remember it. On January 14th, they put on their cover, "What choice?" What choice? And then they answered their own question. 40 years ago, abortion rights activists won an epic victory with Roe v. Wade. No need to deny that. But then they concluded they've been losing ever since. They've been losing ever since. So today, look across the country from State House to State House. We had 2,500 requests for our assistance in the last 2 years alone. 2,500. For us, that's a challenge, but that is a great problem to have. We don't need the White House for the 5th decade of fighting Roe. Ladies and gentlemen, the storm surge is here. Let me conclude with a legend. There's a legend that Ernest Hemingway once bet his circle of literary friends that he could write a story in 6 words that would make them cry. 6 words that would make them cry. The result was this: for sale, baby shoes, never worn. He won his bet. He won his bet. In this epic struggle between Batgirl and the baby, my money's on the baby.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Charmaine. Giving us a lot to think about. Remember, folks, that the first word said about Roe in some ways was the truest. Byron White, dissenting, called it an act of raw judicial power. And that's what it was, and that's what we're here to talk about, the consequences of that and how to reverse it. Now, if I could, should I invite the medical? Yeah, they should. Yeah, come on up. Come on up. I want to, while the members of our medical panel are coming up, I want to mention, I said at the beginning that I wanted to recognize board members and advisory board members. And since we started, one of our advisory board members is here, Hadley Arcus. Thank you. And Hadley will be speaking at our reception tomorrow from 4 to 6, so that's another reason for you to come for our Advocates for Life reception. I'm going to introduce Janine Maxwell, who will introduce the panel. Janine is Vice President for External Affairs and Corporate Counsel at AUL. She graduated from Boston University's School of Law with honors and clerked for 2 Supreme Courts, Massachusetts and Missouri. Prior to coming to AUL, she was General Counsel at CareNet, the largest network of pregnancy resource centers in North America. Janine.
Thank you, Bill. Now, I am under 40 years old. I won't tell you my exact age, but that means that I grew up in a generation that only knew Roe. Now, that means not only am I missing a generation of colleagues and friends, but I also live in this generation that has been impacted by the negative effects of abortion. And it's no wonder that my generation is rejecting abortion, which is why I'm very excited to introduce today's panel of medical experts who are going to talk about the effect of abortion on our society and on women specifically. Donna Harrison is board chair of Americans United for Life. She's a medical doctor and a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist, and is the director of research and public policy for the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, APLOG, one of the largest special interest groups within the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. She is also the immediate past president of APLOG and has served as chairman of APLOG subcommittee on APLOG subcommittee. She is also a chairman of the Board of Directors of Americans United for Life. Additionally, she has lectured extensively as a continuing medical education speaker to physicians groups, medical professional groups, and medical schools across the United States as well as internationally. She has spoken before the FDA Reproductive Health Advisory Committees and has addressed numerous congressional subcommittees, as well as presenting before the United Nations on the status of women. It's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monique Shiro. Dr. Shiro serves as an assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology in the Department of Obstetrics, and she received her MD from Brown University and her MPH from Harvard University, and in 1991, her BA from Mount Holyoke College. She completed her residency from Yale University, and her research includes genetic risk factors for adverse pregnancy outcomes in long-term health, racial disparities in women's health, genetic risk factors for racial disparities, as well as health services research in women's health and women's veterans, health care, and health. She has published in several medical journals, including the Journal of Clinical Outcomes Management and the Federal Practitioner. And finally, Dr. Priscilla Coleman. Dr. Priscilla Coleman serves as a professor of human development and family studies at Bowling Green State University, receiving her MA from James Madison University and her PhD from West Virginia University. She has been widely published in several journals, including but not limited to the British Journal of Health Psychology, Psychology and Health, the Journal of Anxiety Disorders, Current Women's Health Reviews, Childhood, a Global Journal of Child Research, the Canadian Medical Association Journal, the Medical Science Monitor, American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Infant Mental Health Journal, and the Journal of Youth and Adolescence. And I'll also mention that Dr. Priscilla Coleman's research was instrumental in the amicus brief filed by Americans United for Life in the recent case in South Dakota that upheld the suicidal advisory for women in their informed consent law. Please welcome our panel of medical experts.
I'm waiting for the PowerPoint to come up. I'm going to try not to make this too technical, but I do have a few slides that talk about physiology, so I want you to bear with me, and I'll try to make them as easy as possible. I'm going to start off talking about medical abortion because that's a place where, as Charmaine was talking about, a place where the strategy around abortion has changed. There we go. So I'm going to try to answer 6 questions. What is a medical abortion? How does it work? How often is it used? What are the risks? What restrictions apply or might apply? And where are things going from here? Medical abortion is the use of a chemical or a chemical regimen to kill the implanted embryo or fetus and cause the expulsion of the unborn child and placenta. When we talk about medical abortion can actually take place through all trimesters, according to medical definitions. But I'm going to focus mostly on what's used in the first trimester. And the most common regimens used in the first trimester are mifepristone, which is RU486, and misoprostol, which is Cytotec, or a combination of methotrexate, which is a chemotherapy agent, and misoprostol. But there are other medical abortion regimens used, and there are other medical abortion regimens in development. This is a page from the latest WHO recommendations over the summer, this past year, 2012, and they're kind of shocking. What they're recommending is that mifepristone and misoprostol be used as a first-line abortion agent around the world, regardless of gestational age. So for pregnancies up to 9 weeks or 63 days, mifepristone and misoprostol, that is the first section up here. For pregnancies of gestational age after that, they're talking about mifepristone and misoprostol, but they require that to be administered in a healthcare facility because when you administer mifepristone and misoprostol in the second trimester, you have a huge incidence of major hemorrhage. So unlike the first trimester, where they're sort of saying you can give this and send the woman home and see her back in a month, second trimester is recognized as a very dangerous time to have a misoprostol and mifepristone abortion. And then for gestational age over 12 weeks, and we're talking all the way up through, they recommend repeated doses of vaginal misoprostol after a premedication with mifepristone. All right, why do I talk about that? I want you to understand the scope of where medical abortion is going worldwide. And I also want you to understand a little bit with this slide about how it works. So bear with me, and we'll talk through this slide. What we have is 2 menstrual cycles. This is a menstrual cycle without a pregnancy, and this is a menstrual cycle with a pregnancy, okay? So what you see is that in the ovary, there's a place where an egg is forming, and then the egg is released. That's ovulation. That is a very brief period of time. That's a moment. And that egg has to be fertilized within 24 hours or it disappears. So believe it or not, there's only 24 hours out of the month when you can actually get pregnant. But since sperm live for a longer period of time, about 5 days at the outset, the range of when intercourse can happen and result in pregnancy is much wider. So 5 days before ovulation, and then it has to happen within 24, 48 hours after ovulation. Okay, once the egg is released, then the ovary forms this funny looking thing called a corpus luteum, which literally translated means yellow body, because it makes a lot of hormones. And the hormone that it makes is this hormone here called progesterone. So the progesterone level goes up, no implantation, progesterone level goes down, estrogen level goes down, and you have a shedding of the lining called a period. Okay? Well, what happens with a pregnancy? You've got formation of an egg in an egg sac, that's called a follicle. You've got release of the egg and then fertilization. And then there's talk between this fertilized embryo, because once an egg is fertilized, there's no egg left. It's an embryo, a 1-celled embryo, a 2-celled embryo, 4-celled embryo. There's no fertilized egg implanting. Fertilized eggs don't implant. Fertilized eggs are embryos, and embryos implant. So 7 days after fertilization, the embryo implants right here. This is the lining of the uterus. The embryo implants and then sends signals back to the ovary to make more and more progesterone. So what you see is the progesterone level goes up, like here, and then it goes way up, because progesterone means for gestation hormone. That's what progesterone means, okay? All right. So what you have when you look at the structure of progesterone, whoa, baby, what happened? There you go. When you look at the structure of progesterone up here, you're going to notice a little circle and a box, okay? This is normal progesterone, what's in your body. Now, let's look at mifepristone. You see the same sort of structure, but in the box, there's a different group, and in the circle, there's a different group. This change in the structure allows mifepristone to act like the wrong key in a lock. Now, if you've ever had I had a Honda once that my husband had a little different kind of a car. And I had a copy of his key, so I went out once to put it in the Honda, and I put it in, and it broke. Didn't turn the car on, couldn't get the key out. It was a mess. Anyway, it's the same sort of thing happening. What happens is the mifepristone goes to the same place the progesterone's supposed to go, and progesterone's supposed to turn a key in a lock to cause the cells to change. The mifepristone blocks it. I want you to notice something else, too. This is CDB 2914. Who knows what that is? That's Ella. That's olapristal. That's Ella that is now available, somebody just told me, at State College in Pennsylvania in a vending machine for $20 a pop, okay? Ella, ulipristal is equipotent, equally potent with mifepristone. That means, so the same dose, it's the same potency. But Ella is approved for contraception. Aha, and here's the link with the HHS mandate. There is no mistake about why Ella is available. Ella is the second generation RU46 that's now basically available, $20 a pop at vending machines at State College, Pennsylvania. You can see the structure is roughly the same, and it has the same activity. Okay, well, how often is medical abortion, RU46, used? If you go to the CDC, for 2009, there were 784,000 abortions reported from 45 states. There's many states that don't report. 16% of these were medical abortion at less than 8 weeks, and that was 1/4 of all abortions performed at less than 8 weeks. And that's 2009. We're 4 years out from that. Remember, it was only approved in 2000. So the use of medical abortion has increased dramatically. What I want to bring your attention to is this terrible slide that's busy. But if you look over here, this is surgical abortion, curettage, okay, and here are the numbers, less than 8 weeks, or less than 13 weeks, greater than 13 weeks. Here's medical abortion, less than 8 weeks. But look at this, we have almost 1% of abortions which are medical abortions that greater than 8 weeks gestation. Okay. What are the risks of an abortion? The risks of a medical abortion are the risks of other safe abortions. And that is short-term risks like hemorrhage, infection, surgical complications, incomplete abortion, ongoing pregnancy, and ultimately death. The long-term risks of safe abortion include preterm birth, adverse psychological outcome, which Dr. Coleman's going to go in great detail, so I'm going to skip all of these long-term complications, and premenopausal breast cancer, and Dr. Shiro is also going to talk about the long-term complications. So I'm going to focus mostly on the short-term complications. There was an excellent article that came out of Finland looking at 42,000 women, and in Finland, this is all registry-based. They own your medical record. What they concluded was startling. The overall incidence of adverse events was 4-fold higher in medical abortions compared with surgical abortions. Almost 1/5 of patients who had a medical abortion had a complication. In surgical abortions, it was about 1 out of 20. The risk of hemorrhage, medical abortion, 15% versus 2% for surgical. Risk of incomplete abortion, 6.7% versus 1.6% for surgical. Risk of emergency surgery, 5.9% as opposed to 1.8% for surgical. Why is that important? Well, when you put your $20 a pop in for your Ella, and you take 3 of those trying to abort your pregnancy, who's going to manage your risk? Who's going to manage your complications? It's got horrendous implications for the future. It also has implications for telemed abortions. So this woman faces a computer screen and says, oh yes, I know I'm less than 7 weeks pregnant. Nobody's examining her. Nobody does an ultrasound maybe, and the doctor on the other end says, it sounds like I believe you, pushes a button and she gets her medicine. Who's going to manage these complications? Okay. So what are our restrictions on medical abortion? Well, the FDA had actually intended to put restrictions on, and that's why the FDA used Subpart H. Subpart H was designed to try to allow the FDA to have some post-marketing restrictions, but all of those post-marketing restrictions were skipped. They've all been flaunted. So the FDA is impotent. The FDA has RU46 under the Risk Evaluation and Management System, listed since 2008, but nothing's been done. AUL has been instrumental in state regulations, trying to allow the state, which has the ability to regulate medicine, allowing the state legislature to decide how RU46 would be used and to restrict that to the FDA protocol. And that's been bitterly fought. And finally, what you have, and for all you lawyers here, I hope you talk to your malpractice buddies, because the final end would be tort malpractice law. There are a few malpractice cases. It's notoriously difficult to sue an abortionist, but it is one hope that there would be some check on this willy-nilly use of what is a very dangerous drug for women. Thank you.
At the end, okay, great. Forward, back. Here's the laser pointer. Forward, back? Oh, no, forward, back. Okay. Laser pointer. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, my name's Dr. Monique Shiro. It's a real pleasure to be here and be here in Washington, even with the snow. So I'm going to talk today, sort of springboarding off of some of the issues that Dr. Harrison brought up, looking at complications of surgical abortion. I'm going to try to tie in a few questions about abortion reporting and also consider some of the links between abortion and cancer and autoimmune disease. Okay, can I get my first slide? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, it's no problem. That's fine. Okay, so I think that's Dr. Coleman's talk. There we go. That looks like my... Yeah, I think that's it right there. Try that. Yep, that's it right there. Great, okay. Here we go. So our objectives are to review. I'm going to go really fast. I'm going to warn you right now, I'm a research geek, and data is my thing. So we're going to review data on abortion incidence and complications, short and long-term complications, and to assess the relationship between abortion restrictions and abortion complications. Very interesting association. This is CDC surveillance, which, as Dr. Harrison alluded to, is incomplete. One of the reasons is that California, Delaware, New Hampshire, and Maryland do not report any abortion data whatsoever. So the estimated number of abortions through CDC data are 65 to 69% lower than Guttmacher's. Guttmacher uses a different methodology to assess for abortion incidence. What they do is they actually contact abortion clinics and abortion providers. So it provides an additional dimension, and there are a lot of questions about how complete their data are. But one of the things that I want you to look at here as well is that if you look at further, not at the numbers, because as you can see, this is way below the approximately 1.3 million abortions a year that we know occur in the United States. But if you look at excluding the states, Alaska, California, Delaware, Louisiana, Maryland, New Hampshire, and West Virginia did not report numbers to CDC during different years and different periods of time. So this is a tremendous issue in terms of trying to ascertain what is the denominator. So when we're trying to look at pregnancy and abortion complications, we have the numerator, which is the number of abortion complications that occurred, but it's based on the denominator of all abortions, and that's a moving target that we don't have a good handle on. One of the things to look at here is that, as you can see, the vast majority of abortions occurring at early gestational ages. The first column is less than 8 weeks, 9 to 13 weeks, 14 to 15 weeks. Why is that? Because as we all know, there is an approximate, well, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the incidence of complications rises dramatically with gestational age. And so you can see that the number of abortions in greater than 21 weeks is low in all states, except actually for Georgia, which had almost 1,000. This is 2009 data, which was the last time the CDC compiled their data. But Georgia had a very high number of late-term abortions, as did New York. So what are the complications of surgical abortion? Just looking for a moment at surgical abortion. Their short-term outcomes are mortality, morbidity. Morbidity includes infection, bleeding, uterine perforation with damage to the bowel or bladder, emboli, and what that refers to as blood clots or clots of fetal tissue that travel to the brain, anesthesia complications for those procedures like second trimester and later abortion that require general anesthesia, and cardiac or cerebral complications, usually occurring in women who have pre-existing cardiac disease that is not diagnosed prior to their procedure, and usually in older women. The long-term complications that we're aware of are preterm birth. There's a fairly clear, and we'll talk about that in a minute, fairly clear association, which has now been rigorously documented for preterm birth. Mental health issues, again, I'll defer to my colleague. Autoimmune disease and cancer, and I say possibly, and I'm going to tell you why it's possibly. But autoimmune diseases include diseases like lupus and scleroderma, the incidence of which has been increasing dramatically ever since Roe v. Wade. This is risk factors for legal-induced abortion-related mortality in the United States. This was a 2004 paper, which is what we most frequently cite when we're looking at the risks of abortion in the by gestational age. And again, I'm moving quickly here. But what you can see is that as the gestational age, in other words, as the duration of pregnancy, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, increases, the risk for complications increases dramatically until, if you get over 21 weeks and you're doing a pregnancy termination, the relative risk for a complication is 76. That's an enormous risk. Okay, that's absolutely enormous. And in general, what out of this study came the data that say that for every increased week of gestational age, there's a 38% increase in mortality. So that's where those data and that citation come from. This is looking at at legal-induced abortion mortality rates as a function of gestational age. The blue line on the top is 1972 to 1979. As you can see, the mortality has decreased in part because different techniques have been advanced, which have fewer complications than some of the older techniques that were used. But as you can see, the mortality rate, and again, this is mortality, this is not infection, this is a woman dying from a complication of abortion, increases fairly steeply after about 14 weeks, even in the most recent wave of data that these researchers analyzed, which was 1997. Okay, and then the causes of death, the distribution of the causes of death, as I said earlier, hemorrhage, infection, embolism, anesthesia complications, and then unknown. These are some immediate complications after medical compared with surgical termination of pregnancy. And so one of the burning questions for OBGYNs has been, is medical termination of pregnancy safer than surgical termination of pregnancy? I'm not going to answer that. That's like a whole talk in and of itself. But this was an extremely well-designed study that looked at the question of what were the immediate complications of using either mifepristone or misoprostol or surgical curettage. So if you look at this slide, the white bar is pregnancies that were 42 days or fewer. Now, this study only looked at pregnancies with a gestational age of 63 days or less. The vast majority of these pregnancies were dated by ultrasound. And so as you can see, the complication rate is significantly higher for medical abortion than it is for surgical abortion. And the three complications that they looked at, or that are apparent on this slide, are hemorrhage. Hemorrhage was much higher with medical abortion, which makes sense. When you perform a surgical abortion, you usually have suction, you have instruments available, whereas medical abortion, the patient just goes home and can just bleed out. In the area of infection, risks were a little bit higher with medical abortion, again, because there is a duration, and this duration of time is unknown, between when abortion is induced and when it actually occurs. And then for the risk of incomplete medical abortion, in other words, a woman takes her abortifacient drug and then waits, expels part of the baby, but part is retained, usually the placenta, is much higher, again, with medical as opposed to surgical abortion. As you can see, the risks of hemorrhage were higher with medical abortion. Infection rates were higher. Risks of incomplete abortion, as I said earlier, as well. Now, what does this mean? Looking at all of those data, and again, I know I'm flying through this, but we'll have a Q&A after all of us have had a chance to present our talks. Abortion is clearly less safe, at later gestational ages. No one is going to argue with that. The other issue to keep in mind, and especially from a policy perspective and working at the state level and the clinic level, is that the characteristics of women seeking abortion at later gestational ages are different from those for women seeking abortion at earlier gestational ages. Women seeking abortion at later gestational ages tend to be poorer, tend to be more likely to be involved in violent relationships, tend to be more likely to be ethnic minorities, and tend to be more likely teenagers. With the teenagers, that brings up the question as to whether these pregnancies are the result of statutory rape. Very often a kid will hide her pregnancy as long as she possibly can. And so one major target for trying to reduce the incidence of later abortions is to try to focus on that particular aspect, because decreasing late abortions is key to reducing abortion-related mortality and morbidity. Now, what are some of the long-term complications of abortion? Bhattacharya in the 2012 study found that induced abortion in a first pregnancy increases the risk of preterm birth. Surgical, as opposed to medical abortion, increased the risk with a greater risk ratio, and that makes sense. When you perform a surgical abortion, you dilate the cervix, and there's mechanical damage to the cervix. If you look at their data, it shows that miscarriage was about equal to, miscarriage was slightly less likely to cause subsequent preterm birth than abortion was. This is another study looking at birth outcomes after induced abortion. This is an excellent study. One of the co-authors was Dr. Gisler, and this is based on registry-based data of first births in Finland. This must have been a very difficult study, statistically speaking, to do. Most of these abortions were surgical, which was very interesting because I would think that in the Scandinavian countries there would be a preference for medical abortion, but that was not the case. And 97% were done for social reasons. The increased odds for very preterm birth were seen in all subgroups. If you had one abortion, you had about almost a 20% increased risk for preterm birth. 2 abortions, 1.5 times, and almost 3 times the risk, 2.78 after 3 abortions. If you had more than 3 abortions, in addition, you had an increased risk for preterm birth at less than 37 weeks and low birth weight. Now, I want to talk briefly about fetal microchimerism. This is a very geeky topic, but it's extremely fascinating. So what it is that it's the presence of fetal cells in the maternal blood and tissue after pregnancy. For example, I have a 16-year-old son. If you were to biopsy some of my tissues, you would find some of his fetal cells in my tissues, okay? And this, yeah, it is kind of cool. It's kind of weird, but it's also kind of cool, okay? And fetal microchimerism, you can detect it in blood within the first 40 days post-pregnancy. But within tissue, fetal cells tend to live for very, very long periods of time, 30 to 40 years. And the presence of fetal cells in maternal tissue is associated with autoimmune disease such as lupus and scleroderma and with cancer. This is a very geeky slide, I'll admit it. But what this is looking at is the likelihood of fetal microchimerism, the likelihood that you would have fetal cells in your tissue post-abortion, post-miscarriage. And they found that if you had a surgical abortion or a termination of pregnancy, you were much more likely to have fetal cells in your tissue and in your blood post-procedure. Now, as I mentioned, there's a very well-described association between fetal microchimerism and autoimmune diseases such as scleroderma. In addition, the incidence of autoimmune disease has increased dramatically since Roe v. Wade in women. Autoimmune disease is primarily a disease of women. It's increased dramatically since that time. Now, just want to talk briefly, because my time is about up, about the association between fetal microchimerism and cancer. The data are very conflicting. Fetal microchimeric cells appear to be possibly involved in both tumorigenesis, in other words, the stimulation of the formation of cancer, but also repair. And that may explain why there are these divergent results for breast cancer. It appears that in some women, having the fetal stem cells, because when you have a termination of pregnancy, those stem cells that come into the woman's body from the fetus are very, very immature. They're pluripotent. There's some evidence that those cells are possibly more likely to cause tumorigenesis, to be carcinogenic, as opposed to the cells that you acquire when you have a baby, which may be involved in repair mechanisms. okay? And that may account for some of the decreased risk for cardiovascular disease and certain cancers that are seen in women who are paras, who've had a baby. And then also may explain the heterogeneity in the data about breast cancer and induced abortion. I want to talk extremely briefly about this. This is a study that looked at legal restrictions, the effect of legal restrictions on the incidence of complications of abortion. What this showed is that states with abortion funding restrictions had lower complications from abortions. States without abortion funding restrictions had higher complications. States that had mandatory delays, in other words, you had to have a 24-hour, 48-hour waiting period, also had lower abortion complication rates. And it shows that the odds ratio for the effects of these restrictions was 0.79, so a 25% reduction in the rate of complications for states that had more restrictive legal factors. Why is that? Because if states have more restrictive laws, you're less likely to do late abortions. If you reduce the number of late abortions, you're going to reduce the number of complications. So just to summarize, abortion reporting, as I said earlier, remains flawed. It's a major impediment to getting an accurate assessment of abortion complications. Surgical abortion is associated with both short and long-term complications, some of which are serious. And improved abortion reporting, appropriate informed consent, public information regarding abortion complications, and legal restrictions could help reduce abortion rates. Thank you.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Priscilla Coleman. I'm not sure what I have to do to get this. Okay. Great. Just want to test it for a second. To advance.
To advance, put it over your shoulder and click this.
What's that? Oh, okay.
Take it back, and this is the
Okay.
winner.
All right, can I get rid of that? All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I am going to be talking about the psychological problems associated with abortion from the peer-reviewed literature. And like Monique, I love data, but I also like pretty pictures, so I tried to make it a little interesting that way. The two general areas that I'll address are what are the characteristics and situations that put women at most risk for mental health problems following abortion, and then I'll also look at some of the common negative post-abortion mental health problems from the literature. I just conducted a search of all the academic literature looking at articles published between 1972 and 2011, and that yielded over 100 studies related to demographic, personal, relational, and situational factors that increase risk for post-abortion mental health problems. So what are these factors that seem to be most prevalent in the literature? We're going to review them briefly. And this information was really helpful recently in my work with South Dakota with their newer bill. So that was the impetus for doing this extensive study, but now we have this information that can be shared widely. If the pregnant woman is pressured or coerced by others to abort, 9 studies document this risk factor. If she's religious or views an abortion to be in conflict with her personal values, 10 studies. The pregnant woman was ambivalent about the abortion, experienced decision difficulty, and or had a high degree of decisional distress. 21 studies document that risk factor. If she was committed to the pregnancy or she preferred to carry the child to term, 7 studies. Belief that abortion terminates the life of a human being and or the woman experienced some bonding to the fetus, 6 studies. And it's interesting because the data indicate that about 50% of women who undergo an abortion actually believe that they are terminating a human life, but often psychologically it becomes a situation where they feel like it's my life versus this child's life, and so it's almost like a self-defense reaction. Also, you may not think that women would bond to a fetus that they're planning to abort, but there are some studies out of Australia that have shown that very early bonding does occur with many women. If she had pre-abortion mental health or psychiatric problems, 31 studies. The other side is always eager to say that it is only these women who have prior psych histories who are vulnerable and most likely to be, harmed or upset after an abortion. But the newer studies that are out there, and I will talk about the strengths of the newer studies, many of them we've controlled, other researchers have controlled for prior psych history. So although these are vulnerable women and they certainly need care, we have to realize that it's not just the psychologically vulnerable women who have pre-existing issues who are harmed by abortion. If the pregnant woman was an adolescent or a young adult, 15 studies, oftentimes here it's not the person's own decision, it's a boyfriend, it's a parent, it's someone else. She was in a conflicted, unsupportive relationship with the father of the child, 24 studies. The pregnant woman experienced negative relationships with other people in her life, 28 studies. If she had character traits suggesting emotional immaturity, instability, or difficulties coping, 42 studies. Indicators of poor quality abortion care, so if the woman reported feeling misinformed or inadequate or had inadequate counseling, negative perceptions of the staff, etc., 10 studies. Even abortion, I don't like to quote abortion providers, but even several abortion doctors agree on these risk factors. Back in 1995, almost 18 years ago, Baker stated, in the cases where women do react negatively after an abortion, there appear to be predisposing factors linked to those reactions. There's enough valid research from which we can attempt to assess a client's potential for negative reactions after abortion. And she stated that there are these factors that are predisposing: belief that abortion is murder, low self-esteem, ambivalence about the decision, intense guilt and shame about the procedure, perceived coercion, and commitment to the pregnancy. Even the American Psychological Association has acknowledged risk factors in the 2008 task force report, which I could talk to you for 5 hours about how problematic it was, but they at least acknowledge these risk factors. You can't deny them. The literature is just that strong. If the pregnancy is wanted or meaningful, if there's pressure from others, opposition to the abortion from partners, lack of social support, commitment to pregnancy, ambivalence, and low perceived ability to cope. So despite the availability of strong research documenting risk factors and professional awareness, abortion providers rarely, if ever, routinely screen for risk factors and counsel women at risk. So that's kind of the risk factor area. And then looking at psychological consequences, there is an abundant literature comprised of methodologically sophisticated studies from around the world that now indicates abortion significantly increases risk for the following mental health problems: depression, anxiety, substance abuse, suicidal thoughts and behavior. And there are other outcomes that haven't been as extensively studied, like sleep disturbances, eating disorders, and some other problems as well. A minimum of 20% of women who abort suffer serious, prolonged negative psychological consequences. Abortion is further associated with a higher risk for negative psychological outcomes when compared to unintended pregnancy carried to term. There are at least 8 studies that have used unintended pregnancy as the comparison group. And the data indicate the risk for long-term psychological injury is considerably higher with abortion than with other forms of perinatal loss. So there are many strengths to the newer literature. Back in the 80s and 90s, we really didn't have a strong literature base, but we certainly do now. And the studies that are out there have larger samples, many that are nationally representative, controls for prior psychological history, and controls for personal and situational variables that are associated with the choice to abort. We also now have long-term data collection with low dropout rates, use of appropriate comparison groups, and comprehensive measures of mental health, often with actual diagnostic codes that were assigned by professionals. The strongest studies published between 1995 and 2009 are synthesized in my recent meta-analysis that was published a little over a year ago in the British Journal of Psychiatry. Just a little primer on what is a meta-analysis. By systematically combining the numerical results from many high-quality studies addressing the same basic question, and in this case the question is there an association between abortion and mental health? This yields very reliable results. Studies are weighted statistically, and meta-analysis offers a logical, more objective alternative to traditional reviews. The other side has not produced their own meta-analysis. They do narrative reviews that are subject to a great deal of bias. So within my meta-analysis, I had strict criteria for which studies to include. I only included the larger studies with at least 100 participants, where there was use of comparison groups, no abortion, pregnancy delivered, or unintended pregnancy delivered, one or more mental health outcome variables in that set that I mentioned briefly before, because they have to have sufficient number of studies to put them into the meta-analysis, and then controls for variables associated with the choice to abort. The first meta-analysis, which included 36 adjusted odds ratios from the 22 studies that met criteria, yielded a pooled odds ratio of 1.81. So what does that mean? That means that women who have had an abortion experience an 81% higher risk for mental health problems of various forms compared to women who have not had an abortion. And here is the just one of the graphs from the meta-analysis, and I realize you can't see it from there very well, but you can see the pattern of data. If abortion were not having a systematic impact on mental health, all of those horizontal lines would be centered around the middle vertical line, but instead they're shifted to that right quadrant, and that indicates a pattern of data beyond what you would expect if there wasn't any difference. So just glancing at that, you can see something is happening. A second meta-analysis was conducted with separate effects based on the type of outcome measure. And so looking at those, I found the level of increased risk associated with abortion varies from 34% to 230% depending on the nature of the outcome. In a third meta-analysis, separate pooled odds ratios were produced based on the type of comparison group. And then here, even when the comparison group was unintended pregnancy carried to term, there was a 55% increased risk. So it ranged from 55% to 138% depending on the type of comparison group. And then looking at population attributable risk statistics that are derived from the pooled odds ratios, we were able to definitively say that 10% of the incidence of mental health problems was directly attributable to abortion. And then I just want to mention some key points. So the recent narrative review published by UNC Chapel Hill researcher and clinician Dr. John Thorpe. These were some of his conclusions related to mental health. He covered, I really encourage you to read this. It's just published, and it really covers the gamut of physical and psychological problems. But in the psychological mental health area, he said that findings are mixed and subject to methodological shortcomings. Numerous studies from the vast literature do indicate harm associated with abortion, and he references over 100 studies in his review that are in the mental health area. He has over 300 references in that article. It was pretty impressive. And then he also said the 10% PAR from the Coleman meta-analysis underscores the need for continued research attention as women who abort experience, quote, a disproportionate share of mental health problems. There are studies with different conclusions, beginning with the APA report in 2008. There have been several narrative reviews on abortion and mental health suggesting that abortion is generally not associated with adverse mental health consequences. And I see that I don't have any time or much time. I have reviewed several of the existing studies, empirical studies and reviews, and they're available at the website for a new nonprofit that I recently founded, and Dr. Shiro is one of our affiliates. We have 10 MDs and PhDs from around the world. Our goal is to disseminate information and to foster more effective collaboration. So I have critiqued the APA review up there, and I was going to talk about the Royal College review, which the timing of it was very interesting, came out right soon after the meta-analysis, and the conclusions were very different from the meta-analysis, and I was going to point out here how terribly flawed it was. I'll make talk about one slide here. They had a ridiculously unjustified dismissal of studies. And this report was like 250 pages, and people just were not weeding through the details, but it was blatantly biased, craftier than the APA report. 35 studies, most identifying mental health risks, were eliminated based on what they called no usable data. Well, what does that mean? They never told us what that meant. Fewer than 90 days follow-up. Well, the problem with that, if you eliminate the studies that have early follow-up, you're eliminating the most serious cases. There are many problems with the review, and I would just like to conclude here and share Stacey Zalley's story, if you don't take me out of here with a hook, but I do really feel like this is important because, okay. So I was served as an expert in this case, and so I have a lot of information about Stacey and her family. At age 20, as a result of pressure from her boyfriend, Stacey underwent an abortion. Shortly afterwards, she asked for psychiatric help, but she ended therapy after only 3 months. Sadly, after several suicide attempts, she hung herself in her room. Her parents didn't know about the abortion until after her death. In her suicide note, she expressed desire to be reunited with her baby, who she had named Brittany Lee. And her father, George Zalley, who owns 8 grocery stores, but since Stacey passed away, has really not focused on the businesses at all and has founded this nonprofit. He is not personally pro-life or pro-choice, pro-information, and he's done a lot to help the cause. The personal impact of abortion is often profound human suffering, with the most serious cases like that of Stacey Zalley entailing lives full of potential, needlessly ending long before they should. Continued denial and distortion of the literature by abortion clinic personnel, the media, and professional organizations leaves hundreds and thousands of women untreated like Stacey. Each day, a significant number similarly find the shame, loss, and depression of abortion simply incompatible with life. And I just would like to add one more tidbit. I left some handouts. There was criticism of the meta-analysis, the paper published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, lots of letters, and the editors allowed me to write a rebuttal, and Clark Forsythe had asked me to go over the criticism. I knew in 15 minutes I would never get to that. So I made copies of the letter, the rebuttal, and there are plenty of them back there. And I also had a 2-page data sheet, information sheet that is from the We Care site that covers why this meta-analysis is important, and I have some flyers related to We Care as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, doctors, and all of Dr. Coleman's material is out on the AUL display table, so please do take it. I'm sure she doesn't want to carry it back with her. And you left plenty of time for questions, so we are perfectly fine to take some questions now. We have some microphones. I'll come to you. Tom Glessner from NIFLA. A mic is coming to you right now. This is Kelsey.
Okay. Particularly for you, Donna. Are you familiar with the recent research that came out from Mary Davenport on reversing RU486? And if so, some comments would be interesting.
Yes, Mary Davenport, Dr. Davenport collaborated with a couple of other physicians looking at the physiology and understanding that RU46, like Ella, is an anti-progesterone. What would happen if you gave women who changed their mind high-dose progesterone to try to overcome the inhibition, and it turns out it works in some cases. It's very preliminary information, but there are a whole lot of docs who are looking at possibly maybe, forming a more complete analysis.
Great. Other questions? In the back here?
I'm Cheryl Wetstein with the Washington Times. Last year, Kathleen Sebelius shocked a lot of people when she did not approve over-the-counter status for emergency contraception, including Plan B and I guess Ella. Can you talk about whether, what your thoughts are on that particular decision? Plan B and Ella are different products. What do you think?
I'm sorry, your question was about Plan B specifically, or Plan B and Ella? Both, okay. So with Plan B, this was not the topic of my talk, so I didn't bring it up, but there are actually 3 studies showing that the efficacy is about 45%. in preventing unplanned pregnancy. So I think sometimes about me prescribing a drug and telling my patient, well, this will work less than half the time, but that's okay, you know. So I think that it's entirely possible that those data became available and they realized that over-the-counter issues were not going to be significant. Another very interesting perspective on that, I don't know if Donna wants to comment, is that there is at least some evidence that the use of Plan B in very liberal settings increases rates of STDs and cervical dysplasia by changing women's behavior. With RU486 and Ella, I think we really don't have any long-term data on the effects of these medications. They're very, very powerful. There are some clinical applications outside of abortion for mifepristone, but even those clinical applications, for example, with fibroids, show that it's an extremely powerful drug. And we really don't have any insight on what total progesterone blockade does to a woman mentally and physically and otherwise. I don't know if you have any questions.
Yeah, just one other comment, and that is when you have a medication over the counter, then anyone can use it at any dose at any time. And what's been studied is single use once in a cycle, but that's not how women tend to use emergency contraception. They tend to use it after each act of intercourse, which can mean multiple uses during multiple exposure during a cycle, and especially with Ella, Ella has a very long half-life, which means that it will tend to accumulate. So there's some real significant medical concerns. And frankly, I was very happy that Secretary Sebelius made this decision, though it was kind of surprising that she would put, women's health above the politics.
And I'm sorry, that is all the time we have for questions, but please thank our doctors for presenting this very informative discussion today.
If you're like me, you wish we had a lot more time for questions and that our doctors could have gone on and on, because it's fascinating, the research that they have done and are aware of and that we all need to know.